It was quite an experience getting him here at that time, which involved having to hire a jet at the last minute to get him to his next speaking engagement in Tampa. It wasn't quite that nail-biting to get Chuck Todd here today, but there was a sigh of relief that his flight was on time this morning and NBC didn't pull him away at the last minute. I want you to know that it was on this exact date, November 17th, that Chuck Todd first came in 2008 and gave us an election overview. So much has changed since President Obama's first election. Chuck has chronicled the president's first 6 years in office in a new book, The Stranger, which came out just last week and will be for our book signing today in the lobby. Chuck has taken the country by storm as the new moderator and managing editor of Meet the Press, the longest-running show in American television history. He also serves as political director for NBC News. Prior to his selection for his new post, Chuck Todd served as NBC's chief White House correspondent, and he became political director of the network in 2007. And we miss him on the Daily Rundown because we know how well he analyzed the White House soup of the day. When he was named to Meet the Press, NBC News President Deborah Turner said, "There is no one with a bigger passion for politics than Chuck. So since we always like a little passion around here, join me now in welcoming back NBC's Chuck Todd."
Well, thank you. I think this is the first time I've ever had to speak in front of somebody I'm related to. So you guys have to be nice to me since I have grandma here. It's really just protection, you know, from everything. I'm also a native Floridian, by the way. Born and raised in Miami. Flash to you here. I'm not ready to talk about Saturday. But put it this way, the new job, Sunday mornings, and football Saturdays, they don't go hand in hand. And I remember this. Tim and I used to be, Tim used to email, and we'd watch football games together essentially on email while he was watching something, and he'd email, and then I'd email him something, he didn't respond after 9:30. I'm like, come on, you're not staying up for the games? Now I understand. You don't stay up for the games. Trust me, I'm running on fumes still. I'm going to try to go, we'll go about 20 minutes and then leave a lot more time for the Q&A, because I think in some ways that'll direct the conversation. But let me give you my quick overview and where I think, where we are. And that is, it's a political whiplash, I feel like, in some ways that the country has. And we may look at it and say, oh my God, it's been political whiplash over the last 6 years or over the last 8 years. But I'd actually put it all the way back. We've been going through this version of political whiplash, I'd argue, going all the way back to '92 and the advent of Ross Perot, right, in that election. And we've really been very closely divided between the two parties ever since. And we've become, as an American electorate, increasingly impatient ever since. Going back to that time. But if you think about it, I mean, we really have sort of just shifted things back and forth in Washington with incredible speed. So Perot gives us our first president in a generation who doesn't get 50% of the vote in Bill Clinton. And of course, he was channeling an economic anxiety that I'm going to get to in a minute. In '94, the first time in 40 years, Republicans get control of the House of Representatives. And there's this, you know, sort of reaction to the Clinton presidency. '96, Clinton sort of reacts to the Republicans in Congress, and he's able to get 49%, not quite 50. '98, we go through impeachment. 2000, there was an election in 2000 that came down to a certain state. I can't remember which one. I think this county may have had something to do with it. But we had the 2000 election, which is essentially the country, you know, I always say nobody realized how important that election was until after. The collective shrug before the election. Between 2000 and 2002, the Senate switches party hands, you know, thanks to a party switch, and then in 2002, Republicans get it back. 2004, the polarization of the country front and center. We saw one of the closest presidential elections since the last one. 06, the Democrats take over Congress. In 08, sort of another version of this. Then 10, we go to Republicans. 12, the Democratic coalition comes back, and then we saw what happened in 14. So as you can see, it's been a 22-year. We're basically a whole generation of this dissatisfaction with the direction of the country, is what I would argue, because you don't have changes like this constant change, unless you have almost collective dissatisfaction. So I think you can't look at what happened this year and not take into account what's been going on in the last 22 years. And it all comes down to a single issue, and that is the economy, and more importantly, economic anxiety. I think the biggest thing that Democrats are trying to learn from the 2014 election is how there's some Democrats in Washington that sit there and say, how is it if the economy was one of the two most important issues that Democrats didn't get credit for the improving economy? And I think it's because it's how the economy is improving and where the economy is improving. The economic recovery is very uneven. And that's not to say that economic recoveries in general after recessions, they do begin unevenly. Certain areas recover faster than others. But this one is particularly acute. And I got a taste of it just traveling through the state of Georgia. But if you really look at this Senate map, you can see why Democrats are at a disadvantage because of how this economic recovery is going. In Georgia in particular, but this is really, the picture is this way all over the country, the economic recovery is doing pretty well in urban areas. Jobs are being added. The unemployment rate is dropping because jobs are being added. But you can go 100 miles away from an urban center and go to a county, and that's all over Georgia in particular. It's really acute in Georgia, but you can do it in the state of Iowa, I can do it in the state of Virginia, I can pick any state in the union, we can do it here in Florida. And you'll see a county that had a similar drop in unemployment as, say, as an urban or a heavily populated suburban county, but for totally different reasons, because the jobs disappeared. The labor force shrunk. And that's what I think is coloring people's attitudes about the economy. Obviously, we've had wage stagnation. That hasn't helped. But we're in this we have this economic anxiety about us that has been lasting for quite some time. And it's pretty obvious why. We're going through a larger transition. And if you look back at the arc of American history, some of our most tumultuous times in American politics coincided with an economic transition. So we had a very tumultuous politics around the turn of the century, the rise of third-party populist movements all over. Sound familiar? When we were moving from an agrarian to a manufacturing industrial-based economy. There were people getting left behind. There was anger about that. Gave rise to whether it was Teddy Roosevelt going bull moose, William Jennings Bryan, and this. So now here we are. We're transitioning from a manufacturing industrial base to this new globalization, service sector economy, whatever we're going to end up calling it when all is said and done. And there's a lot of people being left behind. And in many ways, when you look at the Tea Party movement or the populist movement on the left, it actually all has its roots. We can go back to what Ross Perot was talking about in '92, which is why I begin my conversation going all the way back to '92. Then, remember what he was talking about? Oh my God, he was talking about outsourcing and manufacturing jobs disappearing, and he was really tapping into sort of that anxiety in the industrial Midwest, which, by the way, is still there. It's just now more acute. I love to give an example of where my dad grew up. He grew up in a town called Waterloo, Iowa. Waterloo, Iowa had a good manufacturing economic base for decades. Meatpacking plant, I think it was Rath Meatpacking Plant, John Deere had a big footprint there. Now the meatpacking plant is gone. John Deere has shrunk, moved a lot of operations. When they build tractors for Chinese farmers, they build them in China. They're not building them in Iowa. And the economy in Waterloo, there's a new casino that opened up. And that's, this is a small city in Iowa. And it's not just a small town, it's a small city. But the job base is very, very stagnant. So a casino or the home health care sector, healthcare, we know that's one of the few areas that's growing. And and maybe, and then usually government is the other big employer, small government, city government, schools, et cetera. And that's no way, and so when you're raising a family there, you don't feel like there is an economic ladder anymore in towns like this. Well, if you look at where Democrats and Republicans were fighting for control of the Senate, it was in places that were more rural, in places where the economic recovery wasn't happening as quickly. And I think overall, Washington's been out of touch with this because if you look at where we are, the economic recovery has been going gangbusters in Washington, D.C. All along, I call it the Acela corridor. We have this fast train. It'd still be considered slow in Europe, but it's a faster train that takes you essentially from the Acela, takes you from Washington to Boston. Well, in that corridor, boy, things are going great. The recession was, our housing prices didn't go up 5% this year. They stayed stagnant. I tell you, a lot of people living in Des Moines or Little Rock or Wichita wish they had that problem during the Great Recession. A lot of people here in Florida wish they had that problem during the Great Recession. So I think there's been this, this is a case where you're sort of a product of where you're living and what you're seeing. And so I think it's been one of these things that has kept Washington from being too in touch with what's going on. And I think this is going to be the driver of politics until we sort of settle things down, until the economy feels like it is growing for everybody. This wage gap issue isn't going away. The issue of job creation isn't going away. The answer is not outsourcing. We all know this. I've toured factories that have 3 people that run them now, right? Because it's all automated. It's robotics. That's the other problem where jobs went away. So this is going to be an ongoing challenge, and it's going to be used to easily manipulate voters. And I say easily to manipulate, not to sound like Jonathan Gruber up here and Mr. MIT, but that's the thing. We know politics at the end of the day is usually playing on some fear, right? Democrats will do it with outsourcing. Republicans will do it with government and regulation sometimes. We want to hand you somebody to blame, right? So the Tea Party movement rose up on the right and they said, blame Washington, blame regulation. They're the ones holding things back. You had the Occupy Wall Street movement, essentially, and some progressives on the left that say, blame Wall Street. They're your problem. They've been doing it. Fact is, we've got a larger collective problem here, whether it's on education, what kind of workers that we're educating that are prepared to compete 24/7. There's all sorts of larger issues we need to tackle here. The question is whether Washington is mature enough to do it. So we have what we have, and it is like I said, it is, I believe, all rooted in this larger economic anxiety that the country's going in. So the question is, what's going to happen? And I think we're getting a taste. We spent $4 billion to decide which party is going to be in charge of the gridlock, apparently. I used it as a cynical way of asking the president a question about 3 months ago about, does it really matter? And he laughed at the premise of the question, which is not a healthy start, right? Meaning he secretly agreed with it without having to say he agreed with it. But that's essentially what we have. And it looks like, after 72 hours of kumbaya talk, it's all gone. Both parties have what I call policy nuclear weapons, that they're ready, that either one of them could detonate, and the other side will use it as an excuse to just say, I'm taking my ball and go home. With the Democrats, with the White House, it's immigration. With the Republicans, it's health care. And there is sort of the idea of rationally finding a middle ground on either one of those issues in Washington right now, out the window. It is too heated. We get to a point, and this is where when an issue where and it can happen on many issues, where you get to a point where you can't, where opposition or support becomes a cultural decision, becomes an identity, a self-identity that, if you were, so for instance, you may think on gun control issues, well, why can't we negotiate a background check at gun shows? The whole idea is sort of culturally an attack as far as some people are concerned. So you get to the point, and this can happen on healthcare, I feel like it's happening on immigration, it can happen more and more, where it's no longer a debate about the policy and trying to find a way to how do you get 60% to agree on something. It becomes if you're for it, you're sort of attacking your own cultural identity. And that can make politics on one hand incredibly passionate. sometimes fun to follow, but it also, I think, can make policy making extremely difficult. And I feel like right now on healthcare and on immigration, we've gotten to the point where support and opposition has become a cultural identity issue now, rather than having it sort of where we can sit back and have people sort of rationally debate, okay, what's working, what's not working, can we come up with a compromise here? That's out the window. And that's something that I think that we have it's a huge challenge for American politics right now. And it's a huge frustration. And in fact, that's how I want to close my remarks, even though I'm sure there's going to be some questions in 2016. Happy to talk about 2016, but I don't get to talk in front of a civics group like this very often. And I say this because you guys have to start demanding better politics. An easy thing for me to say is our politics is broken. And it's easy to say because it's true. And we can all, people can look at their own ideological bias and they'll pick out something on the other side that says, yes, it's broken because they do this, or yes, it's broken because the other side does that. It's broken. It's broken in a big thing. We don't have politicians that practice the art of politics anymore. Yeah, you know, if imagine getting along with your neighbors in the way Democrats and Republicans in Capitol Hill try to get along with each other, right? There would be war zones. You know, people. You know, I imagine. You know, I always say I've got the occasional neighbor who doesn't bring a grocery bag when they walk their dog on the yard. You know, you artfully negotiate, sending a message to that neighbor. Maybe you put up a sign that says very nicely, please pick up, or something like that. I tell you what you don't do. You don't put the poop in like a paper bag and light it on fire, right, on their house or something like that. That's the equivalent of what happens on Capitol Hill. And I think that it is, and here's what it's doing, right? It's becoming so, and the reason I want to leave you with this is, I feel like we have the collective IQ of people that run for the Senate and the House has been going down every year. Well, that's not supposed to be an applause line. But there's a reason why. I think more and more people look at public service and look at the running for office and think, what do I need this for? I'm going to get dragged. My reputation is going to be destroyed if I lose. And if I win, maybe in 10. I mean, look at the governor's race here in Florida. The loser was going to be disliked by more than half the population. We knew that going in. It is the caricature that proves the stereotype. And by the way, Florida, you weren't unique this year, sorry to say. Every major Senate and gubernatorial race got to the point where there were so many negative ads, there was so much negativity about the race that both candidates by the end had higher unfavorable ratings than favorable ratings. How do you govern? Right? You know, nobody was happy with the result. They were just happy maybe that so-and-so didn't win. And I think so you have that mindset, so I think that drives good people away. Yes, the money issue is, I think, an impediment to some people. It's obviously this thing is crazy. I mean, let me just go through the exponent. Here we are 14 years removed from the most infamous presidential race in our lifetimes, right? Bush versus Gore in 2000. Do you know the two of them collectively, they abided by the limits, collectively they spent $130 million on their general election, $130 million. This was to compete in about 12 battleground states, by the way, in the fall campaign, $130 million. Obama and Romney each raised and spent over $1 billion. Okay? That's not, I'm not talking, everybody wants to talk about outside money. That doesn't count George Soros, Tom Steyer, the Koch brothers, Sheldon Adelson. That didn't count their money. This was Barack Obama and Mitt Romney raising over $1 billion. That kind of exponent. Can you imagine if wages, by the way, grew by that much since 2000? Everybody be in a good mood, right? You know, we've had wage stagnation, but not in the campaign world. So there's that intimidating factor. There's the fact that the media is now this flat nature, and so social media in particular, incredibly vicious. It has encouraged a very negative dialogue in politics now. You don't disagree with your opponent. You smear them to the point that you hope they hope that they don't participate in humanity anymore. I mean, you totally, it is a totally destructive way to have dialogue about politics, and it's really, it can get very frustrating. Opposition research now. The two political parties feed this. They try to find everything, even positive things in your life get turned into negatives. Everything gets leaked out about your personal life. And I assume there is anybody here lived a perfect personal life? You know, the point is anything can look bad in a moment and in a campaign, and everything gets used now. And there is no, and so then it adds to the idea that politicians are just all craven, bad, you know, ambitious people, when they're really no different than any other human being, but we sort of take this extra level of glee in tearing them down. Let me make sure I got my whole list here. Oh, Congress as the institution itself, you can't do things in Congress anymore as a rank and file member that you used to be able to do because of the way the leadership of the two parties has perverted the process and taken all power away from members. Basically, the leadership runs everything to the point of, and look, leaders are elected in Congress to do one of two things, get power or keep power. They're not elected to legislate. If they legislate, it's in the best interest of, it is only done in the best interest of advancing the cause of either getting or keeping power. It wasn't very long ago that you had individual members who would go out on their own, or chairmen that would work together, and the leadership was sort of hands off. So there's a sense that if you go to Congress, you're not going to be able to get anything done unless you get elected to the leadership, and the only way to get elected to the leadership is to be a partisan bomb thrower. And then from there, what kind of constructive things can you get done? And then, of course, we've got the power of the special interests, which is growing enormously. One of the reasons why the Washington economy is so good is because a chief of staff to Congressman X can literally trade in that job and make 10 times what their boss makes the very next day when they decide to trade. That is something wrong with the process, and it sort of screws up the divide between the interest groups. And so all of it together, the point is that some people say one thing is the problem. It's money, it's this, it's the media. It's all of it collectively. And we're bringing down sort of, I had somebody ask me, I gave a talk out in San Francisco, and he says, I want people to want to be in politics. But now I don't think mama doesn't want to let their babies grow up to be politicians, right? I mean, there isn't, I grew up idolizing the U.S. Senate, any senator. You idolized a member of Congress, then you start covering them, and that idolization. But I want to look up to them. You want to have these, and we should get to the point where it's an honorable profession again. I mean, yes, but it isn't honorable right now. It isn't being practiced honorably. It isn't, and it is. You know, there's a reason. We spent more money than ever on a political campaign and fewer people turned out. They're not buying the dog food. It doesn't matter how much money you throw at the country to say, buy this dog food. They're not buying it. There needs to be some introspection. I think it needs a disruption. The times that you get more people engaged and the times that you get more political parties to sort of reform themselves is when there's an outside disruption. Ross Perot caused it. By the way, more people participated in the process the year he ran. Teddy Roosevelt caused it with Bull Moose. I look at Uber is causing it in the taxi cab industry. It's like a new thing, disruptive industries. Politics badly needs to be disrupted. The two political parties badly need disrupting because it is something that more and more people are realizing they can't rely on Washington to do anything anymore. That's not a good place for us to be. So on that happy note, I will stop there, and we can talk about whatever you want to talk about in some Q&As. But you guys have the power to demand better.
I think he's probably glad. Am I on? Okay, now. I think he's probably glad he got to fly in this morning instead of showing up in his big bus with his picture on the side. And so we're glad to have him, and we sincerely thank you for taking the time to come. If you have questions ready, please wave them in the air and we'll bring them to the head table. Okay, the first two questions always come from our students.
Excellent.
So, if the G-Star School of the Arts students are ready with their questions, just say your name and then ask your question, please.
I'm Emily Bickowitz, and I just wanted to know, now that the elections are over, do you think the United States will send U.S. troops to combat ISIS?
I think it's inevitable that we're going to be sending more troops. The question is, what are they going to be doing, and how are they going to be doing it? And is Congress going to actually take more responsibility? Frankly, I mean, I think we do need a new war authorization. It's sort of bizarre to me that we have this blandly worded authorization that gives the power of the president to do a lot in the name of terrorism. And I think that at some point there needs to be both legislative branches need to be owning this decision. So I think the assumption is that that's going to happen. But I wonder how close we're getting to a tipping point on this, on ISIS, on where you're going to have, I think I could tell you the policy the president hopes is the one he can pursue. And I actually think there are a lot of Republicans that secretly hope he can be successful in this, is managing ISIS. And nobody will ever say it. You can't say it that way. But there is no stomach to send 125,000 ground troops to Iraq or Syria. I don't think there would be any sort of collective public support for that. And frankly, if you look back, how do you know that that's going to work? I mean, one of the things I chronicle in my book is I'm pretty convinced that in 20 years, maybe in 20 years, former President Obama will say he doesn't know why, he doesn't think that sending the extra 130,000 troops to Afghanistan was necessary in looking back in hindsight. And I think that I don't know if we're quite at where we were with Vietnam, where at some point there is this collective sort of left-right agreement, okay, no more. You're just going to have to manage this issue without always making the answer ground troops. I think we're getting there with ISIS, where it's counterterrorism, it's a strike force mentality, but I think we're going to send a few more troops. It's going to feel like mission creep. But at some point, I think there might be where the public's just going to say, you know what, it's never going to end. We got a minimum of 25 years of instability in the Middle East while they sort out their issues. How much should the United States be engaged in that or not? And I think that you may see a left-right coalition in that direction.
Next question.
My name is Kim Damus, G-Star Student Government Treasurer. Who do you think are the most likely contenders to Hillary Clinton in the Democratic Party?
In the Democratic Party, I think, let me just list them off here. Look, she is in a different place. There's a few ways I always describe this with Hillary Clinton. There's some people that want to say, oh, she's been here before. No, she wasn't. She was never as commanding of a front runner inside the Democratic Party as she is today. 8 years ago, there was Clinton fatigue. You knew it was there. Before there was Barack Obama, Mark Warner was like raising all sorts of money around among Democrats who were not ready to hand the party back over to Clinton. There was true Clinton fatigue. 8 years later, there's Clinton nostalgia inside the Democratic Party. There's Clinton fatigue in the press, and that's going to be a separate challenge for her. I think there's definitely, I always say that I worry about, there's a phrase that I use with myself and with the fellow reporters and anybody that works for me. I say, always be careful of been there, done that disease, where you just assume, and it's an accident all reporters, any of us in the reporting business do sometimes. We've seen it before. We think of course we know how this is going to play out and da-da-da-da-da. There's no person that will potentially fall more victim to that by the general press corps and the press narrative than reporters that cover the Clintons, because it doesn't take much for all of us to have our bad memories come back of covering the Clintons. It's been an antagonistic relationship pretty much since Jennifer Flowers, and it's never really ended. So I think that is going to be among her challenge. Now, I think a 2-year-long campaign where she is just running on her own She could use a good primary challenger, I think, simply to sort of get better on the campaign trail. But I just don't see somebody that, look, if Elizabeth Warren wanted to run for president, I think she could sort of give Hillary Clinton some problems. I'm not as impressed with Elizabeth Warren as a candidate. She represents a growing faction inside the Democratic Party, but if you actually saw her campaign, her campaigning skills are very mediocre. She's just not a natural politician, and I think that'll get exposed over time in places like Iowa and New Hampshire, and she'll look aloof and separate, and it'll be very easy for, I think, Hillary to dispatch of her. But I do think Hillary needs a good primary challenge. I don't know if she's just going to get one, though.
So you sort of answered this next question. How do journalists, in order to remain impartial and effective, resist the seduction of power?
I think it's a constant. I'll tell you one line I always love in the movie Almost Famous. Philip Seymour Hoffman's character is with the kid, and he gives him this one piece of advice that I always think is the best piece of advice. Don't be friends with the rock stars. The rock stars aren't your friends. You just have to always remind yourself of that. I mean, look, on one hand, the push-pull, particularly executives who don't have to be journalists, but executives, the pressure they can put on you on demanding you get access to somebody, and at the same time, that is a challenge when you work for a large organization. You have, but I think over time, you have to remember. I think journalists have to remember they still have an audience that the politician needs, and I do think that we've lost some of that advantage, right, with the flattening of social media, and certainly I think one of the challenges I'm having on Sunday morning is that I'm not the only place somebody can go to introduce a new, if you had a new idea you wanted to introduce, used to be you'd want to go on Sunday, let it get rigorously vetted, right, by an impartial journalist. Now, if you say, I'm going to go to a friendly interview environment. If you're a Republican, I'm going to go to Sean Hannity, unveil this. Or if you're a Democrat, I'm going to go on a Chris Hayes and and unveil this, because you don't want to have anybody poke holes in the idea. You just want to drum up interest on your bases, and I think that certainly adds to the challenge. But I think you just have to say to yourself, you have to remind yourself of certain things. Don't be friends with the rock stars, and create an environment that means your audience is more important to the politician than the politician is to your audience.
As former chief White House correspondent, do you think the 24-hour news cycle has made the daily White House press briefing obsolete?
No, I think putting it on television has destroyed I'm one of these people that advocates taking it off of television. TV has sort of sapped the honesty out of American politics. And we can look no further than 47% video, the Gruber tapes. We have examples all the time. All this is the unintended consequence of all this, and televising the White House briefing. You think you're offering more to the public and more transparency. Instead, what's going to happen is you'll get people that are less and less candid, less and less authentic, more assuming that everything is on the record and they won't say anything. Kind of like what I'm doing up here, right? But I think that in general, my fear is like the more we've made stuff free and easy to see, but particularly on television, I think the less helpful it is. I mean, you see, you'll get us TV guys, you feel the pressure. Whoa, if it doesn't look like we're giving hell to the press secretary, then we're going to get grief. And so you end up seeing reporters preen, the press secretary preens. I can tell you the most helpful information-based briefings are the ones that are not on camera. Period. They can still be on the record. They're not on camera, and that's not an insignificant thing. So I've said this because the print reporters complain about this all the time. They complain about us TV folks hogging up everything, and I said, take it off television. I said, I'll support it. I'll publicly support it. I'll be one of the TV guys. Do a briefing once a week, twice a week on TV, and the other 3 days a week, do it off camera.
What do you think history will have to say about President Obama?
I think none of us will be alive. No, but you have to remember, this is sort of no, I say this because the perceptions of presidents change over periods of time. How many people here have been watching the sort of LBJ renaissance and wondering, what happened to Vietnam? Right? I mean, no, I mean, just, right, I mean, it is sort of and I'm just saying, like, it's funny how a president gets viewed differently historically based on whatever the moment and the challenge in the moment is. So why has there been a revitalization of LBJ interest? Well, because there's a lot of people out there, particularly liberals, who think if Barack Obama were only more like LBJ, right, and just would go in there to Congress, twist arms, buy this guy, do this, and all this stuff. So it is sort of, you get, and Harry Truman got a revival. I mean, Harry Truman was mocked for years. And then, of all people, it was Reagan that sort of started the renewed interest and renewed positive commentary about Harry Truman when he ran for president. He started talking about him in a positive way to be tough on foreign policy, and he was looking for a Democrat to say he would be like with foreign policy and things like that. So I think that's why I say that. We don't know. I think there's sort of right now, you know, and the way that I'm looking at him, I look at him through the promise of the Barack Obama we were introduced from in 2004, which was the guy that was going to try to rid us of this, what felt like at the time, a decade too much of political polarization and too much emphasis on red versus blue. Well, here we are a decade after he gave that speech, right? The decade after he introduced himself, and he's going to leave office, and we're just as divided, and we're just as polarized, and Washington is just as dysfunctional. Is it all his fault? No, it's not all his fault. But what could he have, I look at it, it's like, well, okay, but what could he have done to improve the situation? Could he have done more? Could he have done this? Could he have done that? And so that's where some of us are, quote unquote, second guessing him, and you can have your opinions about that. But I think right now he's going to get judged on the political climate. But in 20 years, we look back, for all we know, the mileage standards that he set for cars might be the single most important thing for to roll back greenhouse gases that anything he could have passed. And that could be, you know, so I think in 20 or 30 or 40 years, the conversation about this president, about all presidents, changes.
Thanks. So why were the pollsters nationwide so off the mark on predicting this past election night?
Well, you have a couple problems with polling. One is it's obviously harder and harder to do it. There is no agreed upon best practice anymore. Telephone, you get how many people answer the phone if they don't know who's calling? Right? I mean, please. I'm one of the weirdos. By the way, I answer every poll call. So I'm totally like the opposite, right? And guess what? If you don't think they make a note of who answers phones and who doesn't, because you start responding to one poll, it's amazing how you're suddenly on the list and you're the random sample. And so, trust me, I do different things. Sometimes I'm a 19-year-old Republican Latina. Sometimes I'm a 75-year-old male African-American. Sometimes I'm me. So, because part of me is sort of wanting to prove like how you can mess around with the process, particularly the push-button ones. I think the push-button ones are ridiculous. The live phone polls at least give you a shot at having it right. So, look, I think we're in a moment where we've got to figure out new ways of doing this. I think the best practice, I can't say is all cell phone, all live call, all internet, all. I actually think we got to go. Everything old is new again. I'd go back to the shopping mall method. I'd go back to some going face-to-face, combined with telephone, we have a census you can figure out, but you statistically decide, if you divide up the electorate in, let's say, 10 age groups, and 10 age groups, and you can divide them up by ethnicity, you make the decision, okay, how am I going to get the maximum amount of Latinos under 50? Is it in person? Is it cell phone? Is it survey? Whatever it is, and you use the best method to talk to their, and then I think it's going to be a blended method at some point that we're going to come up with. But we're still figuring it out. And I think it means that the good news is the polls, just assume most of the polls are all sort of C- work. So don't let the polls impact who you vote for.
So, what do you expect in the coming weeks regarding executive action on immigration reform, and how would you expect these events to impact us?
I talked a little bit about how I think immigration is sort of this nuclear, bomb as far as politics is concerned, vice versa with healthcare and the attempts to repeal it. Look, I think the Republican base, immigration is nothing can cost you a seat in Congress faster if you're a Republican than being on the wrong side of the immigration issue. And the wrong side of the immigration issue is being on President Obama's side on the immigration issue. We can look at the Eric Cantor defeat. If you look at some of the near misses with some of these Republicans, immigration was the sort of the galvanizing force that sort of rallied the populist base. And you've got to remember who these, I always say that, the rest of the country, I think about, I grew up in Miami in the late 70s, early 80s. Miami is this incredible, multicultural, multi-ethnic city now. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was some tenseness as you had your old Miami folks saying, why is everybody speaking Spanish? And you had you had this tense sort of anxiety, and Miami got through it, and Miami's now this sort of Latin American capital, the capital of Latin America. It's very much a vibrant city. So in many ways, I'm of the mindset that in time, sort of, as Middle America, sort of, particularly up I-35, which goes from basically the Texas border to the Canadian border in the middle of the country, the best Mexican restaurants that I've eaten at in the country, I think, are in the state of Iowa. First-generation Mexican immigrants are all starting their own in these small towns, and so I think it's one of those things that it feels like the next generation and the next generation. It all sort of, like with any sort of immigrant group. There's like tenseness at the beginning, and then acceptance, and then everybody's getting along. By the way, the immigration issue, just so you know, I love reading presidential biographies. One of my favorites that most people have never heard of is called Dark Horse. It's about James Garfield, and it's about how he got the nomination for the presidency on the 136th ballot of the convention. Of course, he was assassinated, and anyway, the book does a really good job of. But he almost lost California on the issue of immigration. At that time, they were arguing about Chinese immigration. So the point is, that's in the 1880s. Point is, there's always a fight about immigration in this country, in some form or another. Right now, it has to do, notice we're always worried about the southern border, even though the biggest al-Qaeda threat we ever had was the northern border, but we don't hear about that, do we? But to answer the question more directly, I think it's going to be the excuse for why nothing gets done after that. I think the president is going to act. And I think the irony here is it'll go through the law. I think Republicans are not going to try to play a government shutdown card or impeachment or any of that stuff, because I think they think the leadership will keep that at check. I think they'll challenge it in the courts, because this is an open question. I mean, yes, you make a decision affecting 5 million people. I mean, I think different judges are going to have different interpretations. I think it's, I think there will be a part of this that gets challenged in the courts. But I think once it's in, I don't think there's a precedent. Once we give a right, we rarely take away a right. So I imagine that it means our immigration policy is going to look like this for a while, because while Congress is polarized and can't get anything big done, this will stay in place for quite some time.
Okay, this is sort of a two-parter. This is about Republicans. Joe Scarborough predicted this morning that Mitt Romney will announce his candidacy for president in 2016. Do you agree? And do you believe that a Jeb Bush-Marco Rubio ticket could ever happen, and could they win?
Well, first of all, legally, Jeb Bush-Marco Rubio couldn't happen unless one of them is a resident of a different state. The president and the vice president cannot be residents of the same state. Dick Cheney was a resident of Dallas County, Texas. And the reason one of the ways we broke the story, NBC broke the story, Pete Williams was from Wyoming, had a friend tip him off. Dick Cheney changed his voter registration card and his residency to Wyoming, and then all of a sudden that's when they knew, because you would be ineligible to win those electoral votes. So they couldn't afford to do that. So Jeb's got to go become a resident of Texas, apparently, if he wants to do it. His son's a resident of Texas, so that would be the easy place to do it. But in all honesty, I don't see a Florida ticket. Here's the whole Romney phenomenon is interesting to me. He clearly He clearly wants the nomination, but he wants to do it without running, which if you've gone through, first of all, there are a lot of people like that. There's 100 U.S. senators that are like that. They all want the nomination without running. But here's somebody that's been through the gauntlet twice. And so he's sitting there thinking, am I going to do this again where I got to debate, I stand up on stage with Rick Santorum, Bobby Jindal, and whoever it's going to be on the... No, he doesn't want to have to do that again. I think what he is hoping is that he is the in case of emergency candidate. Now, the Republicans have actually changed their rules on how they nominate the presidency, and I'm obviously a little bit of a nut about this stuff, of knowing the arcane rules. They've shortened their primary season. They decided to have their convention in early July. They were actually going to have it in late June. They picked Cleveland, assuming the Cavaliers were going to stink. Then the Cavaliers signed a certain basketball player we all might be familiar with down here. And so suddenly the assumption is, well, the arena that they'll use will be in use in June. But they actually wanted to do their convention in late June. But they're going to do it in the second week of July, a week after the 4th of July, because they think one of the reasons why Mitt Romney struggled is that he didn't have enough money, general election money, that he could spend before the convention. I think it's overreacting, and I think it's a mistake in their part. But I think they've encouraged the idea of a brokered convention. There's no penalty for getting out if you're a candidate. I think it's very easily, you could see a Rand Paul sort of have about a third of the delegates. You could see a mainstream governor candidate. I have my doubts about Jeb Bush running, but maybe it's a John Kasich of Ohio or Scott Walker. He gets sort of establishment gubernatorial delegates, and he's sort of the establishment candidate. And then maybe you have an evangelical, maybe a Santorum, maybe it's a Huckabee, maybe it's a Ted Cruz. And you could see them being neither one of them figuring out how to get a majority, but all sort of sitting on, and none of them feeling as if they have to get out to, quote, unify the party because it's an early convention. Well, at that point, you could see Romney becoming sort of the compromise candidate. What's interesting about Romney is the donor community loves him. And the donor community doesn't want to give up on him for this very reason. He is them. I had somebody explain this to me. I know Republican circles like, why do they love Mitt Romney? Because if the country rejects Romney, then most of these donors say, wow, that means the country wouldn't want me as president. Because they see themselves in Romney. Romney's a peer. Romney's the first peer they've ever had run for president. His donor community. And they can't believe he lost. They still can't believe he lost, and they don't want to give up on it because it's like it's looking in the mirror for them. This is a Republican operative who's working for somebody not named Mitt Romney, but who said he said one of the weird things is that there's more passion for him than you realize, and it's more because he's one of them.
Okay, what was the hardest interview you've ever done?
It's always the president. I always say, no, there are two types of interviews that are very different. On one hand, the president can be a difficult interview because they're the president. And at the end of the day, it's harder to interrupt them. But the most difficult interviews are the ones that I've had to do it once or twice, it's when you're interviewing somebody after a tragedy. Those are, I don't know, you couldn't pay me enough to do what Matt Lauer and Savannah have to do, the Today Show, and you know those interviews. Those are, I think, the most difficult. You somehow convince them to be in television, which I'm sitting there going, don't put them on TV. Don't do that to them, working against my business, right? But those, I think, it's after a tragedy. Those are the hardest.
Okay, last question. Who was the most fun person or the most fun interview you've ever done? The
most fun?
Yeah.
I would have to say right now, the person that that gives you the most surprising answers is Rand Paul. I'm not going to call it a fun interview, but Rand Paul right now is you never actually know what he's going to say. And I say this because I wish more politicians were that way. Actually, I think that's part of his appeal. I've noticed that people who don't agree with him on a lot of stuff sort of have like, well, man, that guy sounds. I'll listen to him again. There's something, and I think it's because, and I do think the next person that takes off, the next Barack Obama, right? The person that's sort of the idea they come out of nowhere, or they come from they weren't sort of the establishment pick. The person that breaks through, the next great breakthrough politician, is going to be the one that truly is sort of comfortable in the new media environment, unpredictable in what they might say, and comfortable saying the unpredictable. Not just doing it for cause and for effect, but doing it because it's genuine to who they are. That they sort of, and that I don't know if Paul ultimately has the discipline. I think 2015 is going to be quite the year for him. I think the Republican establishment community is going to come down on him like a ton of bricks, sort of the way Democrat establishment types destroyed Howard Dean in 2003 when they came after him. I think you'll see a similar effort among folks, because Democrats thought Howard Dean was the second coming of George McGovern. There are plenty of Republicans who think Rand Paul is the second coming of Barry Goldwater. We know how those presidential elections turned out. So, so exciting is not necessarily the word I would use, but I think right now he's the most interesting interview to have these days of active American politicians.
Thank you.
You got it.
Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.